I'm Annie Kinning, Communications Manager at Dynamo Energy Hub. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me just say a few words about Dynamo. Dynamo is a global community of clean energy and sustainability startups, innovative corporations, investors, and governments. Dynamo connects like-minded energy professionals through networking opportunities, thought leadership discussions, and special events like the one you have joined today. Through our global community of local hubs, we are building the future of work for the new energy economy and accelerating the clean energy transition. We are thrilled to be co-hosting today's thought leadership panel with NYSERDA on one of the topics necessary to ensure a just transition and mitigate climate risk. Today, we will explore how insurance can better help prepare communities for climate change adaptation and resiliency efforts, as well as help unlock vital technologies needed to achieve net zero goals in the clean energy transition. I'd now like to introduce you to the moderator for today's thought leadership panel, Flora Fua. Flora is the climate finance and insurance lead at NYSERDA. She manages NYSERDA's climate finance strategy, where NYSERDA seeks to launch programs that green the financial system in New York State, increase data transparency in the financial sector, activate credit unions for clean energy finance, develop novel finance and insurance products, and enable the innovation needed in the financial sector to meet the state's nation-leading climate goals. I'll hand this over to Flora, who will say a few words and introduce today's keynote speaker. At the end of today's session, there will be time allocated for audience Q&A, so please send your questions throughout the event through the chat box directed towards panelists. Lastly, please note that the session is being recorded. And with that, I am delighted to turn it over to Flora to get us started.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks for the introduction and for hosting this. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. So NYSERDA is a proud sponsor of this event as we seek really to engage with the insurance industry through our climate finance and insurance initiative. I'm really excited to talk about the intersection of climate and insurance today by bringing together thought leaders of the insurance industry for them to speak about the challenges and opportunities posed by climate change, and learn along the way where NYSERDA can really play a catalytic role in that transformation. I'm really honored to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Mariam Golnaraghi. She's the Director of Climate Change and Environment at the Geneva Association. Over the past 25 years, Mariam's career has spanned working as a senior executive, founder, and entrepreneur, and serving on advisory boards in private and public sectors and the United Nations. She's launched, led, and managed transformative climate change initiatives and multi-stakeholders partnership with systemic impacts to enable transitioning to a resilient low-carbon economy. In 2020, Mariam was included on the list of the 20 most influential on climate change by Insurance CRM magazine, and among the top 100 influencers in the world on resilience by the Leaders magazine. From 1997 to 2004, the pioneer. She was a founder and CEO of Climate Risk Solutions, Inc., and where she delivered innovative climate risk assessment and risk management solutions to companies in the energy, agriculture, and financial sectors, and the US government. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Absolutely a pleasure to be here. And I wanted to thank the New York Energy Research and Development Authority and Dynamo Energy Hub for this invitation, and certainly a pleasure to be with all of you. The theme of today's event is the future of insurance, how climate change is reshaping the insurance landscape. At the Geneva Association, I work with 80 CEOs of the largest insurance and reinsurance companies, accounting for about 18 trillion of assets under management and something near half of global insurance premiums on both life and non-life. And we work together to really pave the way for future of insurance in terms of transitioning to a resilient low carbon economy. Before we think about how the landscape of this industry is going to shape, I think it's really important to first take a look and highlight the industry's value chain, types of institutions that are engaged in this value chain, the critical functions that insurance serve as both risk managers and investors. So in a nutshell, when you think about the insurance value chain, you think about the policyholders. Those can be people, companies, various levels of government, utilities. Then in terms of service providers, you have the primary insurers who enable access to insurance to the policyholders. Then you have reinsurers who actually insure the primary insurance companies. You have brokers and agents who facilitate these transactions between policyholders and primary insurers, or between primary insurers and reinsurers. And very importantly, you have the financial market, where sometimes insurers need to actually raise additional risk capital, and they do that through the financial markets. And they also need to invest the premiums that they collect from their policyholders in order to be able to build a larger capital and stay solvent. Now, from an underwriting and risk management perspective, you have non-life insurers, which you have here in this meeting, versus life insurance companies that offer insurance related to death of individuals. You have social insurance versus private insurance, and social insurance is government administered insurance program with emphasis on social equity and income redistribution, whereas private is more market-based insurance, which is what we are discussing here today. And then you have commercial versus personal. Now, in terms of functions that an insurance company serves, they can essentially transferring and carrying risk is at the heart of the insurance business. Insurers price, assume, and transfer risk on behalf of their policyholders. As risk underwriters, they offer protection, as I said, to people, businesses, and governments. But they do that through three ways. First one is through pooling of risk, where they're pooling similar risk of different individuals or company or entities. They then do retrocession, which is essentially taking cumulative and peak risk and capping them by ceding them to certain portion to a reinsurance company. So today you will have Kelly from a primary insurers, and you have colleagues from Swiss Re that they can discuss that relationship. And then importantly, securitization, which covering certain risks through the financial markets. Now, insurers serve a lot of other functions like claim management and general risk management services that clients could be using in terms of really getting capacity to understand their risk better and how to manage them. On the investment side, bear in mind that insurance industry is second largest institutional investors globally, following the pension funds. Life insurers generally are typically buy and hold investors with durations that could range from 20 to 30 years. And this is very important in the field of climate change, because as we are looking into investing in infrastructure systems and so on with the long-term investment durations, life insurance would be critical, similar to pension funds and other in investing in those areas, whereas non-life insurers are more of geared more towards liquid investments and shorter time horizons, typically 1 to 3 years. So when you think about managing your risk, you think about non-life insurance unless it's related to life. And then when you think about investments in long-term transitioning to a low carbon economy, life insurers are the ones that play a critical role. Now let's delve into role of insurers in terms of building societal resilience to extreme events on one hand, and then risk and opportunities presenting insurance in terms of supporting a low carbon economy, and how do they come in on the ground. Now, first, strengthening socioeconomic resilience to physical risk associated with climate change. And these can be extreme weather events or slow trends, needs to be forward-looking and risk-based. Now, what do I mean by that? Essentially, we know that many things are changing as we go ahead, and past is not a good representation of the future. So if typically insurance companies have looked at historical data to develop their risk pricing and analytics, they are now need to come up with new ways of analyzing the risk, given that some of the events that we are experiencing are unprecedented. Now, managing this risk traditionally has been, when we think about risk associated with extreme events, when a hurricane strikes or flood or forest fires, have typically been expected from governments to manage, but increasingly, this is a shared responsibility with all hands on deck, and insurance is an integral part of that solution. In other words, availability and affordability of insurance depends on risk management measures that we take as homeowners, businesses, governments, utilities, infrastructure owners and operators, among others. So, for example, the action we take through our land zone planning, how and where we build, how do we maintain our assets, how do we assess and manage the risk of infrastructure systems or supply chain with a system-wide thinking around the impact of extreme events, and then what is the role of different stakeholders in reducing and preventing this risk. So obviously, over the last years, we have witnessed unprecedented severe weather events, but we need to bring focus on what is the underpinning causes of this risk. And beyond just the changing frequency and severity of hazards caused by climate change, part of these increasing risk is related to the growing exposure and increasing vulnerability of people and their assets to these factors. For example, increasing concentration of people and assets in high-risk areas such as coastal zones, urbanization, where we are developing, how we are building, and what we are destroying by way of our development. For example, it's now evident that destruction of wetlands, mangroves, and other nature-based systems, which are designed as a natural buffer for managing risk of floods and other extreme events, is now leading to exacerbation of these risks over time. Now, there is also as we witness is there is extreme vulnerability in our supply chains and infrastructure systems. So all in all, as we think about insurability, availability, and affordability of insurance, we need to think about a holistic approach to our risk management that will take people, businesses, governments as part of that. For example, if you're a government or infrastructure owner or a homeowner, you need to be thinking about, do I have access to risk information to make my decisions? Do I know what to do? And do I have the incentives to take measures to reduce my risk? Is there anything that I can do to prevent new risk? And for example, can I use early warning systems and emergency preparedness to that nature if I have a home and I can carry some of the pricey assets into higher floors? That's just a simple one. There is, gets a bit more complicated with businesses and infrastructure. How can I use traditional insurance and what's called alternative risk transfer mechanisms to manage the residual financial risk of my assets after I have taken those measures? And then how do I rebuild after an event? Do I at all build back? Or if I do, how am I going to build back? So these questions needs to be in minds of all of us. And it's not just a government responsibility. Now, coming back to the role of insurance around resilience and adaptation, one of the points that I wanted to highlight is insurance companies have extensive experience and capacity in conducting risk-based pricing of natural catastrophes. And if we truly do this pricing risk-based, that is an important signal to the market as to the level of risk that needs to be managed by different stakeholders. So I cannot stress more the importance of risk-based pricing. Now, the industry is pushing the forefront of risk analytics. I'm leading an international initiative with leading insurance companies around forward-looking climate risk assessment, but converging to best methodologies takes time. And as we look ahead, insurance need to really think about innovation of their products through strategic partnerships with governments, with banking and lending sectors, and real estate development and others to really think about solutions that would be more holistic and lead to affordable and accessible information. Using technology for real-time monitoring of risk, for example, built on the back of digitization, cloud platforms, sensors, drone technology, and artificial intelligence also is coming to play for preventive and proactive maintenance. My third and last message is about role of insurers in transitioning to a low carbon economy. Now, what we need as we look ahead into the next few decades, there is going to be unprecedented transformation across all sectors of society, which needs to happen only in a matter of decades. And starting now, new technologies, new processes, industries, and new infrastructure systems are needed to enable the decarbonization of highest carbon emitting sectors, with energy having taken much attention, and other sectors such as water, food and agriculture, transportation, building, construction, heavy industry coming to the forefront of this focus. Now, clearly we need transformative action in technological innovations, with policies that can incentivize amount of innovation on one hand, and then market development on the other, breakdown of institutional silos and embracing system-based thinking, and finally risk management to enable raising of capital for large-scale deployment of these technologies. Bear in mind that new technologies come with myriad untested risk, particularly when deployed at scale, that need to be managed. And this is where insurers play a vital role in de-risking and backing new untested technologies for large-scale deployment and raising capital. When we think about the risk of these technologies, what are we talking about? We're talking about operational and safety risk associated with deployment of new alternative energy systems, carbon capture and storage systems, batteries, environmental and disposal risks, construction risks, emerging liabilities, for example, linked to climate litigation risk, which we are starting to see in conjunction with implementation of new technologies at scale. For example, 4 cases are being litigated in state of California. Professional mistakes, payment defaults, supply chain risk, and of course, as always, the risk associated with adverse weather on the new systems that we are building. If these are gone unmanaged with a holistic view, new risk associated with large-scale deployment could pose financial and reputational risk to the organizations that are behind the project, and as I said, even lead to litigation risk, as we are witnessing around the world. So given the massive scale of technological disruptions needed across different sectors, insurers need to reconsider their status quo approaches as we look ahead. And this is the foundation of the work that I'm doing with largest insurance and reinsurance companies globally. And the elements of that involves innovation in insurance products and services for large-scale deployment of technology when market conditions allow. Insurance companies need to build extensive technological expertise far beyond their actuarial expertise in their commercial and specialty lines. They also may need to move from traditional project-based coverage to a more integrated approach to addressing client needs. All in all, when it comes to investing, leveraging public and private investments, for example, bringing insurers and pension funds and aligning their risk return profiles with other investors and government is going to be what's going to enable us to pay for the cost of transition ahead. Now, just to close, as we look ahead, I think deeper cross-sectoral partnerships and collaborations to drive out of the box thinking and fast tracking the development and adaptation of new technologies is going to be foundational to our ability to move together for this large-scale transformative change that is ahead of us. With that, I want to thank you for your time, and I would like to pass on the floor to Flor, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for that. That was great. It was a very strong overview of like the needed holistic approach to risk management that we all need to take. Yeah, climate change is accelerating. We also like strongly believe that, you know, cooperation among all actors of the economy is going to be necessary to our collective success going forward. So I think that today it's going to be like a good opportunity for us to, you know, look at insurance as an industry, as being at the forefront to develop new strategy on how best to respond to climate change and the energy transition, but also like insurance as a tool that can help better prepare communities for climate change adaptation, resiliency efforts, as well as you mentioned, to help unlock vital technologies needed to achieve the net zero goals in the clean energy space. So we will hear from like, so I'm very happy to be here today to moderate that and give the floor to the members of our panel that will be where we will be discussing about the nature of risks that we are seeing in the climate space and what the insurance can as a category do and act upon. But maybe before we can get into our discussion, it's kind of time for a short pop quiz, I would say. The idea is really to share like some of the economics of climate change as it relates to insurance sector in order to anchor a little bit the scale of this challenge that we have on hands. So there will be a poll that is like going to pop right now. And we're going to go over like some questions. So according to Swiss Re, global economic losses resulting from natural catastrophe between 2011 and 2020 amounted for more than $2 trillion. How much of those losses were covered by insurance, in your opinion? I leave the audience a bit of time to submit their answers. So maybe, okay, so like the results are in. So that's great. You were like more than 51% to be right. It's exactly that. It's only 35% of these losses were covered by insurance, which kind of like illustrates the protection gap. And I think that today we will have like an opportunity to see like how insurers like have always played a role in addressing societal risks. And we will see how they're thinking about this issue and using the tools that are at their disposal today to solve this problem on a large scale. Maybe we can look at the question 2. That's like more around like the fossil fuel industry and the losses that it could represent. So a team at Verisk recently reviewed 30 years of onshore and offshore fossil fuel large risk losses for the insurance industry. What is, in your opinion, the range of total losses from the fossil fuel companies during this period? We'll leave a little bit of time to the audience for their answer to be turned in. And maybe we can end it now that we have like maybe some here. So only 38% of you mentioned that it was above 50 billion. And I am kind of like sad to announce that like the insurers sustained roughly $60 billion in losses from the fossil fuel company over the span of the last 30 years. So it seems that we have like the right people maybe like on the line today over the panel to show that pivoting from the fossil fuel commercial lines is something that you know, might be kind of like good business eventually. But we can close it here, and I think those like gives us like an idea of the economics of climate change for the insurance industry. And with that in mind, I really want to kickstart our panel discussions. So I will introduce each panelist and ask them to give a few lines about their work in the climate insurance space. So we're going to start with Jeff McCauley. Hi, Jeff. You're the co-founder and the president at Energetic Insurance, an insurtech startup developing novel data-driven approaches to renewable energy project financing for unrated and below investment grade counterparties by covering their counterparty credit risk with a mission to expand and accelerate the market for renewable energy. At Energetic, Jeff leads the underwriting and technology development function. And before that, he formed the distributed energy resources team at EnerNOC, which is now NLX, where he developed partnership and pilots with major energy companies, including Tesla and SunPower. Jeff, could you please tell us a bit about your work in climate insurance space in a few words?
Absolutely. And thank you for organizing this event to you, NYSERDA and Dynamo, and perhaps the best concise introduction to the insurance industry I've heard from Mariam, which was really amazing. So thank you for that as well. For Energetic, we really focus on the last theme that Mariam mentioned, which is supporting the low carbon economy. So we're not dealing with the climate or weather risks. We're really trying to enable project finance to deploy renewable and distributed energy infrastructure. Energetic does that by taking on counterparty credit risk. This is an often poorly understood barrier to a lot of project finance. Many of the technologies that exist today are viable and proven in the field, but lack access to affordable financing because there isn't necessarily a bankable off-taker. And that's the problem that we're taking on with Energetic.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm happy to introduce Kelly Aride, who's the Director of Catastrophe R&D at Liberty Mutual in the Corporate Enterprise Risk Management Group. As part of the Catastrophe Research and Development team, Kelly examines the constantly evolving scientific literature and views it through a business lens to better predict how, when, and where climate change will affect its operations. Hello, Kelly, welcome, and please tell us a little bit about your work in the insurance space.
Thanks so much for having me today. I am a climate scientist by training, and I head up the catastrophe modeling research function at Liberty. So that essentially means that my team takes apart the models that manage our biggest, ugliest, meanest disasters and puts them back together again. And one of the things we're very focused on is trying to understand how climate change will affect both our physical risk within our operations, as well as how those physical risks can start to touch the transition risk that lives in both the asset and liability side of our portfolios.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kelly. And now I really want to welcome Aaron Michael, Senior Product Manager and VP of the Public Sector Solutions at Swiss Re. The Public Sector Solutions team specializes in the development of innovative insurance products for a global portfolio of public clients. Aaron's background focuses on natural catastrophe, parametric risk transfer, design and implementation for earthquake, tropical cyclones, floods, extreme weather, and supply chain. Aaron started his insurance industry career as a senior engineer at Air Worldwide, where he served as a model developer and risk financing project manager for private and sovereign clients. So we'd love to hear more about your work in the climate insurance space, Aaron.
Thanks for the introduction, Flor, and thanks for having us today. Yeah, as Flor stated, I work for the Public Sector Solutions team at Swiss Re, and our role is really to develop risk transfer solutions for local, state, and federal governments. So much of our work is traditional insurance offerings, but increasingly we field requests for solutions that address kind of or underinsured losses, and events that are becoming more common. Heat waves, droughts, floods are increasingly on the minds of government officials, and who often work as the insurer of last resort for their constituents. So we work with those public entities to ensure they understand the risks they're facing and the options they have for mitigating and adapting to those. I'll say that's kind of me as an individual in my group, and as a company, Swiss Re is really focused on making the world more resilient by engaging with these counterparties.
Thank you so much for this brief intro. So let's dive in. There's a lot to cover today, but I would like to maybe kick off the little roundtable and the panel with maybe your views and maybe something that you can brush around, like the main trends of climate insurance lately, and maybe where is the insurance industry today in terms of like forward-looking risk-based pricing and transferring and mitigating climate risks. And you know, maybe like have you like comment on how does it affect eventually like the business strategy, and how do you factor that in? I don't know who wants to kind of like maybe pick that up. Kelly, maybe I'm calling you up on this one.
That sounds great. So, you know, the insurance industry, as Mariam mentioned, has a long history of thinking through how to capture the impacts of physical risks and physical hazards on a book of business. And it puts us in a really unique position relative to other parts of, say, the financial services that are trying to think through the transition risk components of climate change, but don't have that corresponding focus on the physical risks of climate change. So I think it puts us in a really unique position where we can leverage our, decades, and in some cases, in the case of Swiss, centuries of experience in understanding different types of major disasters and applying them in an environment where we expect those to change. So like I said, I work in catastrophe modeling, and catastrophe models are specifically designed to allow you to explore things that you have not seen in your history before. So that makes them a unique tool that allows you to think through how climate change may affect risks that we have not seen. That being said, they also are trained on history. So that's where we see a real role for climate translators within the insurance industry who understand this broiling ferment of climate science that's happening at this interface of climate and disasters, and adjusting the tools that we have available to develop more forward-looking views of risk. So there are some types of risks that really we should all be thinking about immediately, that climate risks are not a problem that we can push off till 2100. We need to be thinking about risks that are happening today. So things like sea level rise is a really good example. Very obvious risk that's already happening. We can quantify it really well. Changes our view of coastal flood frequency. If we're not dynamically incorporating this change as it happens, then we're going to be behind the ball. So that's what my team does, is tries to incorporate all of this interesting external information about climate into our view of how our risk and hazards will happen going forward.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think that the models are really important for us when we view risk, and then we can use those kind of in three distinct ways. And I think that the insurance sector has an important role in doing this. And one is just using those models and our understanding of risk to price it, because just establishing a market price for risk gives you a lot of information, a lot of optionality about how you then deal with that. Then the second way that we deal with that is by kind of the bread and butter of the insurance industry, which is transferring that risk. And then the last way is really by influencing behavioral change. And so this is, it's kind of the play between those previous two. We can price it, and when things become too expensive, people start to change their behavior. And so this is when you get to like the tried and true examples that the insurance industry always likes to go to, of like seat belts and reductions in smoking and life insurance costs. So those are kind of how we think about using those tools at our disposal to start ticking off the impacts of climate change.
No, thank you. I don't know, Jeff, if you want to comment on that, but like just to rebound, and I think this I can end it to you after. What you just mentioned is like the work of like, pricing, research of the market, the transferring of the risk, and then what kind of tool can you use that is in your arsenal as an insurer to really make it like actionable to do behavioral change. So I'd love to hear about maybe, how do you like incorporate those new information into your underwriting innovation process, and what kind of like, you're changing your models, you update your portfolios, you add like probably like new insurance line. So I'd love to hear maybe about like those new mechanisms that you can use, and how could this be eventually used towards the energy transition, to kind of like bring us back maybe.
Yeah. So first on the forward-looking piece, I think that's really important to emphasize. The future isn't going to look like the past in rapidly changing markets. So we see that particularly in electricity markets with high growth of renewable penetration. So a purely backward-looking model isn't really going to be effective there. The same thing is important to know for certain machine learning models, and certainly, when we've got climate change or forward-looking pieces that are important. And so that is, I believe some insurers are limited by their ability to even use forward-looking models, which is why it's an important theme that Mariam brought up. In terms of behavior change, I think for our markets, it's largely enabling behaviors that people want to take. So there's a lot of demand for renewable energy, and the limiting factor is the lack of accessibility or affordability. But once that accessibility is granted, once we have more renewable and distributed generation, we do see the potential for increased community resiliency. We don't have to look back that far to just the winter storms in Texas, where many people lost power, and a lot of the damage in those homes was due to freezing temperatures combined with the loss of power. There were examples of stores or businesses or homes who had distributed generation, who didn't lose power and therefore didn't have as much storm-related damage. So we see this as a virtuous cycle. If we can enable deployment of distributed energy, we're decarbonizing the economy, we're also increasing the resiliency to those homes and businesses in the event of these climate-related storms.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point that you just brought up there, and one that the insurance industry has a unique perspective into, right? Much of the focus on transition risk has been thinking about sort of the economic change, how different companies are going to develop in our new sort of low or zero carbon economy. But what you don't see if you're only looking at the economic side is the co-benefits that you see in the adaptation and risk reduction. I love the example that you have of the Texas freeze, which shows that it's not just that you're enabling renewable energy, but that you're actually reducing disasters. Another really great example that I've seen pop up in California recently is trying to put distributed microgrids out into sort of far-flung rural areas of California. And the reason for this is that wildfire damage is overwhelmingly driven by wind-driven events. And unfortunately, many of those wind-driven events have been started by transmission lines from power companies. So if you need a long amount of transmission lines to connect to a historical grid, then that's a way that you can actually be exacerbating your wildfire risk. So now by having these sort of distributed microgrids out in far-flung communities, you've reduced some of that ultra susceptible infrastructure and helps to transition to a more renewable fuel source. So people who are not looking at the physical risk side may not necessarily have access to or see those co-benefits.
That's I think it's wonderful that you're really like joining like the two part of like the current like challenge that we have. It's like with climate change, we need mitigation measures, but adaptation measures. And the beauty is like nothing works in a vacuum. It has co-benefits, and we need to really start thinking about like a systemic approach to that. That was really like one of the big messages of Mariam. And as a segue for this, I'd love to hear a little bit like about like where do you see the roles of insurers that could play beyond the risk transfer now, and that plays more and more in like in the realm of like the resilience aspects of things, of the communities, and how to keep that in mind, and where do you see the public-private partnership angle there, and maybe if you can kind of maybe brush briefly on some of the concepts on risk transfer and risk reduction, which are not the same thing, but that are playing and how they play together in different contexts, as you were like talking about that.
I can jump in on the public-private partnership part of it, because that's a lot of what we work on. And so, I mean, when you think about government's role, government has this incredibly important and critical role in enabling risk transfer and understanding climate risk to their balance sheet. And after natural catastrophes, we know that, we saw this in the survey, that only a small percentage is actually being covered. And so we have this protection gap. But in the end, who's going to pay for that? The government ends up paying for that. And so we find that governments end up carrying this risk, and then that risk can get passed on to taxpayers through tax increases or borrowing across other lines of the budget or issuing debt. And so there is we like to work with governments to help them think creatively about acknowledging that somebody's going to need to pay for these types of solutions, and they can think about transferring part of that risk, understanding what that risk is, transferring part of it, and using some savings that they might be realizing from that to invest in adaptation measures, mitigation measures, other things that can give them longer term benefits. And so a lot of that is just an educational standpoint. Like we need to work with them and gain trust and help them understand that this is actually eventually going to minimize risk, but it is really that the government ends up being the best distribution mechanism for a lot of risk transfer in extreme events to like marginalized and underserved parts of the community. And so we need to not just say we're going to like privatize that problem away. We need to understand that the government's going to continue to serve that role and support them as best as we can.
Yeah, I think that interplay between risk transfer and risk reduction is a really important one to call out with mitigating climate impacts, because we're no longer at a point where we can sort of pick and choose between, are we just going to focus on mitigation, reducing emissions, or are we going to focus on adapting to changes? Because frankly, with the emissions that have already happened, there are certain climate impacts that are committed, that no matter what we do, we are going to have to live with them for decades or centuries to come. So that means we have to do a both and approach. We need to be working on the mitigation side, because nobody wants to live with the consequences to our economy, to our physical built environment, to people and to communities of uncontrolled, unmitigated climate change. There's a prominent climate researcher who works on extremes out of Australia, who said that if you have a climate model or if you have an economic model that says that everything is going to be okay at 4 degrees C of global warming, that indicates that's not a sign that things are going to be okay. That says that you don't have a model that captures what's going to be wrong. It's like if you were to jump off of a cliff and find that you made it to the bottom and you were fine. Our models do not capture what can really happen that far out of our historical experience. So with that in mind, knowing that we have to mitigate sort of those very far end scenarios because we don't want to live with them, now let's think about what's baked in today. We are already at a little over 1 degree C in warming, experiencing rapid changes in our extreme events. Now, we could argue that the insurance industry should be staying out of that area, right? That, we need to be reducing the risk within the insurance industry. But that risk, if you transfer it enough times, it needs to land somewhere. That risk doesn't go away just because it's transferred out of the financial sector. And I think the point that eventually it gets transferred onto governments and ultimately taxpayers is a really important one. So we need to use and utilize the role of the insurance industry in the economy, which is to spread and distribute risk to mitigate those extreme events, while not saying, okay, well, we're just going to stay out of this entirely. It's a careful balance to strike, and one that we think about every day.
No, thank you very much, Kelly. And I think it's exactly, you're right. We really need to sort of like look at both sides. We cannot like leave one versus the other. There's a lot to play there. And on the mitigation side, maybe I want to hear from you, maybe Jeff, on that one for like these new and untested risks, I would say. Like how do you manage these new and untested risk of new climate tech to scale deployment? How do you really find those innovative approach and bring it to the risk transfer mechanism that insurances usually carry on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think also highlights the public-private partnership aspects and a lot of the work that NYSERDA does. Right, it's in the name, research and development. So a lot of the de-risking of early stage technologies comes with the support of state and federal grant programs. Energetic is a beneficiary of that as well. We were funded by Department of Energy Sunshot, have been fortunate to be a award recipient of NYSERDA as well. And so this is really critical for before a technology is insurable, before it's proved, we need to do that pilot and lab testing. And then I think there's a real partnership in the transition out of that lab or pilot phase into once it's, there's some scale, and then insurers can come in. And there's even a partnership opportunity there as well. Want to highlight an innovative program opportunity notice, which is a loan loss reserve that NYSERDA has. And so that's a way in which you can have public sector risk sharing. And ideally that's to amplify, or that can be amplified in collaboration with private sector lenders or ultimately with private sector insurers. So sharing in that risk pricing for early stage risk can be also very important. And then just highlighting what insurers can do beyond risk transfer, I want to reemphasize Mariam's point is that life insurance on the investment side of the house are some of the largest investors in infrastructure due to the long dated nature of those energy assets. And then lastly, risk selection on the negative side. So when major European insurers say we're not going to insure coal power plants anymore, that's a signal. It actually has an impact on those markets because lack of insurance means it's harder for those businesses to compete, in addition to other fuel price and energy price issues as well. So all important roles for insurers.
So Jeff, you've already sort of answered, and we're going to slowly move to the Q&A section, and we have like a very good question from the audience, but you kind of like already briefly touched upon that, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists on it. It's like, really, how do the insurance operators today, so insurers career, reinsurers, brokers, MGAs, etc., are already integrating the climate change risks into their business strategy? How do they make the evolution? So you briefly touched upon the fact that the Lloyds already kind of like say, okay, the coal we almost stop for like certain like part of the business. So we are seeing like some of some alignment from the big insurance carrier on that front. But there are probably like other things, and I'd love to hear maybe from all of you, like about this alignment, maybe with like few examples, and how does it already kind of like impact the climate journey of the insurance company that you work for?
So insurers, we set the thresholds of risk that we're willing to incur. And so by doing so, we set the signal to industries and governments of whether assets are currently or will be insurable in the future. And so this signaling risk tolerance, as Jeff was saying, kind of spurs action. And we see this, in many different industries. At Swiss Re in particular, the way that we do this is we have a large sustainability report that you can find online, but I kind of summarize it in terms of doing responsible investing. And so we put ESG benchmarks in our investment portfolio, and we make sure that we're actively supporting the transition to net zero economy. We have sustainability provisions in underwriting. So we have a sustainable business framework to assess the carbon risks embedded in our reinsurance business. And we have a commitment to drive that to net zero by 2050. And then we also have exclusions, and Jeff also touched on this, where we're limiting to support to thermal coal plants and mining operations. And as of 2021, we've reduced writing business for the top 5% most carbon intensive oil and gas industries. So we really embed this in our operations, and that hopefully will be that signal.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important, like these price signals, etc. And what Miriam alluded to, and Jeff and yourself, it's like the investment arm of the insurance sector is also a very, very strong actor and player in this in the mitigations effort. I will maybe share another questions from the audience right now. How do you expect insurance companies to own more physical assets distributed